He stood in his boardroom, surrounded by the wreckage of another company he'd destroyed, when his phone buzzed with a text that would change everything. 3 simple words from a woman he'd tried to forget. "I need help." But what happened next shocked even his enemies. This is the story of Alexander Kane, the billionaire who built his empire on fear, who crushed dreams for breakfast and destroyed lives for profit. The man they called the corporate reaper. Until one woman made him question everything he'd ever believed about power, success, and what it truly means to win. But here's what will blow your mind. By the end of this story, the most feared man in corporate America will give up his entire fortune for love. And the woman who changed him. She didn't even know who he was when they first met. Stay with me, because the next 60 minutes will show you how one person's kindness can transform even the darkest heart. I'm going to take you through this impossible transformation in 3 parts. First, the meeting that planted the first seed of change. And trust me, it happened in the most unexpected place. Second, the crisis that forced him to choose between his empire and his soul. And finally, the decision that shocked the entire business world. Have you ever wondered if someone who's hurt thousands of people can truly change? Keep that question close, because Alexander Kane is about to prove that even monsters can become human. Let's begin. Before we start this incredible story, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and let us know where you're watching from around the world. Your engagement helps us bring you more amazing true stories like this one. Enjoy your story. At exactly 5:30 a.m. every morning, Alexander Kane would arrive at Kane Industries, the 60-story tower that cast a shadow over half of Manhattan. By 6 a.m., he would have already ruined someone's day. By noon, he might have destroyed their entire life. Alexander wasn't just ruthless, he was legendary for it. In 15 years, he'd acquired 200 companies, fired 50,000 employees, and accumulated a net worth of $12.7 billion. He had no friends, no family who still spoke to him, and a reputation that made grown CEOs break down in tears at the mention of his name. Picture this. Alexander's office occupied the entire 60th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that allowed him to look down on the city like a predator surveying his territory. The walls were lined with framed newspaper headlines. Kane Industries crushes local business. The corporate reaper strikes again. Alexander Kane, the man who killed American dreams. He kept them as trophies. His daily routine was clockwork precision designed for maximum efficiency and minimum human contact. He'd arrive before dawn, review overnight reports from his global operations, and by the time his executives arrived, he'd already identified which companies to target next. His assistants, he went through 12 in 1 year alone, were instructed never to make eye contact and to communicate only through written reports. Alexander had perfected the art of psychological warfare in business. He didn't just buy companies, he systematically destroyed the spirits of everyone involved. He would study the personal lives of CEOs he targeted, learn about their families, their dreams, their vulnerabilities, and then exploit them with surgical precision. He once forced a rival to sell by threatening to expose the man's son's struggles with addiction to the media. But perhaps most chilling of all was his complete emotional detachment. While others in his position might feel guilt or at least acknowledge the human cost of their actions, Alexander felt nothing. He'd conditioned himself to see people as numbers on spreadsheets, obstacles to be removed, or tools to be used. When asked once in an interview how he slept at night, he replied, "On Egyptian cotton sheets in a bed that cost more than most people's houses." The transformation from human to monster hadn't happened overnight. Alexander's childhood had been a masterclass in emotional neglect and conditional love. His father, Richard Kane, was himself a corporate tyrant who viewed affection as weakness and empathy as a liability. Young Alexander learned early that love was earned through achievement, fear was more reliable than friendship, and showing vulnerability invited attack. By age 12, Alexander was already mimicking his father's cold calculations. By 16, he was manipulating classmates and teachers with the same ruthless efficiency he'd later bring to boardrooms. By 25, when he inherited Kane Industries after his father's sudden death, he'd already surpassed his mentor in sheer merciless ambition. The media called him the corporate reaper, after he systematically dismantled and absorbed Hartwell Manufacturing, a century-old family business that employed 8,000 people across small towns in Ohio. Alexander didn't just buy the company, he deliberately chose the week before Christmas to announce mass layoffs, ensuring maximum psychological impact. When confronted by journalists about the timing, he simply said, "Business doesn't observe holidays." But everything changed on a rainy Tuesday evening when Alexander's car broke down in the worst neighborhood in the city. Stranded and furious, he was about to call for help when a voice behind him said something that no one had dared say to his face in 20 years. "Excuse me, sir. You look like you could use a friend." Her name was Sarah Martinez, and she ran a small community center in the heart of the neighborhood Alexander's companies had helped destroy. She didn't recognize him. To her, he was just another lost soul in an expensive suit who needed help. Sarah offered him shelter from the rain, a cup of coffee, and something Alexander hadn't experienced in decades, genuine kindness with no agenda. She didn't want anything from him. She just saw someone who needed help and offered it freely. The breakdown had happened on Clemson Street, in a neighborhood that real estate developers had written off years ago. Alexander's custom Bentley, armored, bulletproof, worth more than most people's annual salaries, sat smoking and useless against a backdrop of boarded-up windows and graffiti-covered walls. He'd been returning from a late meeting where he'd just finalized the acquisition of 3 more manufacturing plants, deals that would result in another 2,000 layoffs by month's end. His first instinct was rage. Pure, volcanic fury at the inconvenience, at the vulnerability of being stranded in what his security team had classified as a high-risk zone. He pulled out his phone to call for immediate extraction, but the screen was black. The device had died along with his car's electrical system. That's when he heard her voice. Soft, genuinely concerned, completely unaware that she was speaking to someone who could buy and sell the entire neighborhood without checking his bank balance. "Are you okay?" That sounded like a pretty bad breakdown. Alexander turned, expecting to see someone angling for money or recognition. Instead, he found himself looking at a woman in her early 30s, wearing a rain-soaked jacket over scrubs, carrying a grocery bag that clearly contained food for more than one person. Her eyes held no calculation, no hidden agenda, just human concern for a stranger in distress. "I'm fine," he said curtly, the words automatic after decades of rejecting any offer of help as potential weakness. But Sarah didn't retreat like most people did when he used his intimidation voice. Instead, she stepped closer, studying his expensive suit that was now soaked through, his Italian leather shoes that were clearly not designed for standing in puddles. "You don't look fine. You look cold, wet, and stuck. There's a community center right around the corner. We have hot coffee, a warm place to sit, and a phone you can use." She paused, then added with a gentle smile, "No charge, no strings attached. Just neighbors helping neighbors." The word neighbors hit Alexander like a physical blow. When was the last time anyone had considered him a neighbor? When had anyone offered him help without expecting something enormous in return? He found himself nodding before his rational mind could object. The East Side Community Center was nothing like the gleaming corporate facilities Alexander was used to. The building was clearly old, probably a converted church from the 1940s, with peeling paint and windows that had been repaired more than replaced. But inside, it was warm and clean and filled with something Alexander hadn't experienced in decades, the sound of genuine human community. Children were doing homework at mismatched tables. Elderly people were playing chess in a corner while a small group practiced English conversation nearby. The smell of home-cooked food drifted from what must have been a kitchen, and everywhere Alexander looked, he saw people taking care of each other. Sarah led him to a small office behind the main room, handed him a towel and a steaming mug of coffee that tasted better than anything served in his corporate dining rooms. She didn't ask for his name, didn't press him for details about what he did for work or how he'd ended up in their neighborhood. She simply created space for him to exist without judgment. "I run this place," she said, settling into a chair across from him. "We serve about 300 families in the immediate area, meal programs, after-school care, job training, basic healthcare connections. Nothing fancy, but it makes a difference." Alexander found himself studying her face as she talked. There was a light in her eyes when she described helping people, a genuine joy that he'd never seen in any corporate boardroom. She spoke about the families she served not as statistics or demographics, but as individuals with names and stories and dreams worth protecting. "What about you?" she asked eventually. "What brings you to our corner of the world?" For a moment, Alexander considered lying, creating some cover story that would maintain his anonymity. But something about Sarah's complete lack of artifice made deception feel impossible. "I was coming back from a business meeting," he said carefully. "I don't usually come through this area." "Well, sometimes the best discoveries happen when we end up places we don't usually go," Sarah replied with a warmth that seemed to reach right through his carefully constructed emotional armor. They talked for nearly 2 hours while Alexander waited for his security team to locate him. Sarah told him about the community center's programs, about the families they served, about her vision for expanding their services if they could ever secure sustainable funding. She spoke about her work with the passion of someone who'd found their true calling, and Alexander found himself hanging on every word. When his rescue finally arrived, 3 black SUVs that looked absurdly military for a simple car breakdown, Sarah walked him to the door without asking about the obvious wealth and power such a response suggested. "Take care of yourself," she said simply. "And remember, you're always welcome here if you need that cup of coffee again." As Alexander settled into the back seat of his secure vehicle and watched the community center disappear into the night, he realized something disturbing. For the first time in 20 years, he didn't want to leave somewhere. For the first time in his adult life, he'd been in a place where his presence had been welcomed without conditions, where someone had cared about his well-being without knowing anything about his bank account. Over the next 3 weeks, Alexander found himself returning to that neighborhood, watching Sarah from a distance. He told himself it was curiosity, maybe even amusement. But then he saw something that would haunt him forever, a family being evicted from their home because of a decision he'd made in a boardroom 6 months earlier. The family being evicted was the Johnsons, a father who'd lost his job when Alexander closed their factory, a mother battling cancer, and 2 small children who didn't understand why they had to leave their home. And there was Sarah, using her own money to try to help them, money she didn't have. The eviction was happening on a Thursday morning, and Alexander watched from his car as the county sheriff's deputies carried furniture out of a small duplex 3 blocks from Sarah's community center. He'd positioned himself across the street, telling his driver to wait while he observed what he told himself was simply an interesting sociological study. But as the scene unfolded, something cold and uncomfortable began growing in Alexander's chest. The man being evicted was David Johnson, though Alexander didn't know his name yet. David stood on the sidewalk in work clothes that had seen better days, his shoulders sagging with the weight of complete defeat. Beside him, his wife Maria sat in a wheelchair. The cancer treatment had left her weak and dependent on mobility aids she couldn't afford, holding the hands of their 2 children, ages 6 and 8. Alexander watched as David tried to explain to his children why strangers were taking their belongings, why they couldn't go back inside their home, why they had to leave the only neighborhood they'd ever known. The little girl kept asking if they could take her goldfish, and the boy wanted to know if they'd be back in time for school on Monday. That's when Sarah appeared. She came running from the direction of the community center, clearly having heard about the eviction from someone in the neighborhood network. Alexander watched as she immediately went to Maria, kneeling beside the wheelchair and taking the woman's hands in hers. She spoke quietly to the children, somehow managing to explain the incomprehensible in terms that didn't traumatize them further. Then Alexander saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. Sarah pulling out her own wallet, counting out what was clearly every bill she had, and pressing the money into David's hands. It wasn't enough to stop the eviction, nothing could at this point, but it was enough for a hotel room for a few nights, enough to buy time to figure out their next move. But here's what destroyed Alexander. He recognized the address. Johnson Manufacturing had been one of Kane Industries' acquisitions 8 months earlier. Alexander remembered the deal clearly because it had been particularly profitable, a small but efficient factory in Ohio that produced specialized automotive parts. The company had been family-owned for 3 generations, employed 240 people, and had never missed a payroll in 67 years of operation. Alexander had bought it for the real estate and the equipment. The manufacturing itself was moved to cheaper facilities overseas within 6 weeks of acquisition. The entire workforce was laid off with minimum severance, and the factory building was sold to developers who planned to convert it into luxury condos. David Johnson had been the floor supervisor at that factory. He'd worked there for 18 years, starting right out of high school, working his way up through merit and dedication. When Kane Industries closed the plant, David had been 2 years away from qualifying for the pension he'd been counting on to help pay for his wife's medical care. Alexander sat in his car, watching Sarah help load the Johnson family's possessions into a neighbor's pickup truck, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt the sharp, nauseating stab of genuine guilt. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This wasn't numbers on a spreadsheet or abstract market forces at work. This was a real family, a man who'd worked hard and played by the rules, a woman fighting for her life against cancer, children who'd done nothing wrong except be born to parents whose economic value had been deemed insufficient by Alexander Kane's profit calculations. And there was Sarah, giving what little she had to help people whose suffering Alexander had directly caused. He thought about the Johnson manufacturing deal, remembered how pleased he'd been with the profit margins, how efficiently his team had stripped the company's assets and moved the valuable equipment overseas. He'd never once considered the human cost, never once thought about the families that would be destroyed by his perfectly legal, completely rational business decision. Alexander watched Sarah help Maria Johnson into a neighbor's car while David Johnson carried his daughter, who was clutching a small fishbowl with her goldfish swimming in circles. The image burned itself into Alexander's mind, the contrast between Sarah's selfless compassion and his own callous destruction, between her willingness to sacrifice for strangers and his willingness to sacrifice strangers for profit. That night, for the first time in decades, Alexander Kane couldn't sleep. He lay in his penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling, seeing David Johnson's defeated face and Maria Johnson's quiet dignity, and those 2 children who didn't understand why their world had suddenly collapsed. He thought about Sarah, who probably made in a year what he spent on a single suit, giving away money she couldn't spare to help people she barely knew. For the first time since childhood, Alexander Kane cried. Not the calculated tears of manipulation he'd sometimes used in business negotiations, but real, helpless, human tears for damage he'd done without ever seeing the faces of his victims. The weight of 50,000 destroyed lives, 200 dead companies, countless families scattered to the economic winds, it all came crashing down on him in a single moment of clarity. He'd told himself for years that business was just business, that economic forces were impersonal, that he was simply more efficient at resource allocation than his competitors. But sitting in his apartment that night, surrounded by luxury bought with the blood of people like the Johnsons, Alexander finally understood what he really was, a monster who'd forgotten how to be human. That night, Alexander Kane did something he'd never done before. He made an anonymous donation to Sarah's community center, not to ease his conscience, but because he couldn't bear the thought of Sarah losing her home too. What he didn't know was that Sarah was about to lose much more than her building. Because someone had been watching Alexander's visits to the neighborhood. Someone who knew exactly how to use his newfound weakness against him. Alexander began volunteering at Sarah's community center, using a fake name and backstory. For the first time in his life, he experienced the joy of helping instead of hurting. He taught kids to read, served meals to the homeless, and slowly began to remember what it felt like to be human. The anonymous donation had been substantial, $50,000, enough to keep the community center operating for 6 months and expand their meal program to serve more families. Alexander had his lawyers set up a shell charity to make the donation untraceable, telling himself it was just a one-time gesture to alleviate his guilt about the Johnson family. But the donation wasn't enough. Alexander found himself driving through Sarah's neighborhood again and again, watching from a distance as she worked tirelessly to serve people his business decisions had displaced. He saw her organizing job fairs for the unemployed, coordinating with local clinics to provide basic health care, running a food pantry that fed anyone who showed up hungry, no questions asked. After 2 weeks of surveillance, Alexander made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew him. He was going to volunteer. He created a careful cover identity, Alex Marshall, recently divorced financial advisor who'd moved to the city for a fresh start. He bought clothes from Target instead of Armani, practiced speaking without the cold authority that had intimidated corporate executives for decades, and rehearsed a backstory that would explain his availability to volunteer during business hours. When he walked into the community center on a Tuesday morning and asked Sarah if they could use an extra pair of hands, She lit up with genuine joy. "We can always use help," she said, leading him through the main room where children were working on homework and elderly people were playing cards. "What kind of work calls to you?" Alexander had expected to be assigned some menial task that would keep him busy and out of the way. Instead, Sarah asked him about his interests, his skills, what kind of contribution he wanted to make. When he mentioned that he was good with numbers, she immediately suggested he help with their after-school tutoring program. "Some of our kids are struggling with math, and they could really use someone patient and encouraging," she explained. "It's not about being brilliant, it's about helping them believe they can learn." And so Alexander Kane, the man who'd built an empire on crushing dreams, found himself sitting at a small table with 8-year-old Marcus Williams, helping him work through basic multiplication problems. Marcus was one of the Johnson family's neighbors, and Alexander learned that his parents both worked 2 jobs each just to make rent. The boy was bright but behind in school because there was no one at home to help with homework. He'd been coming to the community center since he was 5, and Sarah had basically raised him alongside his overwhelmed parents. "I'm not good at math," Marcus said after struggling with a problem for several minutes. "That's not true," Alexander replied, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "You just haven't learned this particular skill yet. There's a difference between not knowing something and not being capable of learning it." For the next hour, Alexander worked patiently with Marcus, breaking down complex problems into manageable steps, celebrating small victories, and discovering something remarkable. Teaching someone was more satisfying than defeating them. When Marcus finally grasped a concept he'd been struggling with for weeks, his face lit up with pure joy. "I did it. Mr. Alex, I actually did it." The happiness in that child's voice hit Alexander harder than any hostile takeover victory had ever done. This was what winning actually felt like. Helping someone succeed instead of watching them fail. Over the following weeks, Alexander became a regular at the community center. He tutored children in math, helped elderly residents fill out job applications, served meals in the soup kitchen, and even learned basic home repair to fix broken chairs and leaky faucets. He was discovering muscles he'd never used: empathy, patience, genuine care for people who could never benefit him financially. Sarah began to rely on him more and more. She appreciated that Alex showed up consistently, worked without complaint, and had a way of connecting with people who felt forgotten by the world. She didn't know that Alexander had been studying human psychology for decades, learning to read people so he could exploit their weaknesses. Now he was using those same skills to understand what people needed and how to provide it. "You're different from most volunteers," Sarah told him one evening as they cleaned up after a community dinner. "Most people come here wanting to feel good about themselves, but you actually seem to care about the work itself." Alexander paused in his sweeping, struck by the irony. "What makes you say that?" "The way you listen to people. Really listen, like what they're saying matters to you personally. And you never act like you're doing anyone a favor by being here, you act like being here is the favor." She was right, though Alexander was only beginning to understand why. For the first time in his adult life, he was in a place where his value wasn't measured by his ability to accumulate wealth or exercise power over others. His worth at the community center was based on his willingness to show up, pay attention, and contribute to something larger than himself. But Alexander's board members were growing suspicious. His ruthless efficiency was slipping. His cold decisions were becoming hesitant. And when they hired a private investigator to follow him, they discovered his secret that would destroy everything he'd built, and everyone he'd come to love. Sarah and Alexander fell in love slowly, quietly, like sunrise after the longest night. She loved Alex, the kind, generous man who fixed broken playground equipment and stayed up all night with sick children. She had no idea she was falling for the most hated man in America. The change in Alexander was gradual but unmistakable. Where he'd once made decisions with surgical coldness, he now found himself hesitating, considering consequences beyond profit margins. In board meetings, he caught himself thinking about families like the Johnsons before approving layoffs. He started asking questions that had never occurred to him before. What would happen to the workers? Were there alternatives to closure? Could they retrain employees instead of firing them? His executive team noticed immediately. Marcus Webb, Kane Industries' chief financial officer and Alexander's closest thing to a friend, was the first to voice concerns. "Alex, you're going soft," Marcus said after a meeting where Alexander had postponed a factory closure to explore retraining options. "Since when do we care about employee retention during downsizing? We're hemorrhaging efficiency." But Alexander was experiencing something more powerful than efficiency. He was falling in love. It happened gradually, then all at once. Sarah's laugh became the sound he most wanted to hear. Her smile when she saw him arrive at the community center became the highlight of his day. The way she talked about the people they served, with such genuine care and respect, made him want to be worthy of her regard. They started spending time together outside the community center. Coffee dates that turned into long walks through the neighborhood where Sarah pointed out families they'd helped, small businesses that were struggling, children whose lives had been changed by the center's programs. Alexander found himself seeing the city through completely new eyes, not as territory to be conquered, but as a community to be nurtured. Sarah told him about her background, how she'd grown up in foster care, how the community center had been her refuge as a teenager, how she'd dedicated her life to being for other people what social workers and volunteers had been for her. She spoke about her dreams of expanding their services, maybe opening a second location, creating job training programs that could really change lives. "Sometimes I feel guilty for wanting more," she admitted one evening as they sat on the steps of the community center watching the sunset. "We're helping people now, and that should be enough. But I see so much need, and I know we could do more with better funding." Alexander wanted desperately to tell her that funding wasn't a problem, that he could write a check that would fund her programs for decades. But he was trapped in his false identity, unable to reveal the truth without destroying everything they'd built together. Instead, he listened to her dreams and fell deeper in love with her vision of a world where people took care of each other, where success was measured by how many people you lifted up rather than how many you left behind. The first time they kissed was in the community center kitchen after everyone else had gone home. They'd been washing dishes from the evening meal service, working side by side in comfortable silence, when Sarah turned to thank him for staying late and found herself looking into eyes that held more tenderness than she'd ever seen. "Alex," she whispered, and the way she said his fake name made Alexander wish desperately that it was his real one. When their lips met, Alexander felt something crack open in his chest, a warmth and vulnerability he'd spent decades suppressing. He kissed her like she was precious, like she was forgiveness itself, like she was everything good he'd never thought he deserved. "I love you," he whispered against her hair, and meant it more than he'd ever meant anything in his life. "I love you too," she replied, and Alexander's heart soared and broke simultaneously, because she loved Alex Marshall, the good man he pretended to be, not Alexander Kane, the monster he actually was. Their relationship deepened through small moments and quiet intimacies. Alexander would arrive early to help Sarah set up breakfast service, staying late to walk her safely to her car. He fixed the center's perpetually broken heating system, organized the supply closet, and learned to cook in bulk for the meal programs. Sarah introduced him to her chosen family, the volunteers, the families they served, the community leaders who worked alongside them. Alexander found himself welcomed into a network of people who genuinely cared about each other, who celebrated small victories and supported each other through difficulties. For the first time in his life, Alexander understood what it meant to belong somewhere not because of what you could provide, but because of who you chose to be. But the deception was eating him alive. Every time Sarah spoke about Kane Industries with anger and disgust, every time she mentioned the corporate greed that was destroying communities like theirs, Alexander felt the weight of his lies growing heavier. "There's this company, Kane Industries," Sarah said one night as they walked through her neighborhood. "They've been systematically destroying working-class communities for years. The CEO is this soulless monster who treats people like they're disposable. I honestly don't know how someone like that sleeps at night." Alexander's throat tightened. Maybe people can change. Maybe even someone like that could learn to be better. Sarah shook her head firmly. People like Alexander Kane don't change. They're too invested in the system that benefits them. It would take a miracle to make someone like that develop a conscience. That night, Alexander lay awake wondering if miracles were real, and if a monster could ever truly become human enough to deserve someone like Sarah Martinez. But love built on lies has a way of crumbling. And Alexander's carefully constructed world was about to collapse when Sarah received a phone call that would change everything. A call about a hostile takeover that would destroy her community center and displace 500 families. A takeover being led by Kane Industries. When Sarah confronted Alex about Kane Industries, she had no idea she was looking into the eyes of Alexander Kane himself. She begged him to help her fight the takeover, to use whatever connections he had to stop the monster who was destroying her life's work. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Alexander was helping to serve breakfast at the community center. He watched Sarah's face change as she listened to whoever was on the other end of the line, saw the color drain from her cheeks, watched her hands start to shake. "I understand," she said quietly into the phone. "Yes, I'll review the documents. Thank you for the warning." She hung up and stood in the middle of the busy kitchen, staring at nothing while chaos continued around her. Alexander approached carefully, recognizing the look of someone who'd just received devastating news. "Sarah? What's wrong?" She turned to him with eyes full of tears and rage. "Kane Industries. They're buying the entire block. They're going to tear down the community center, all the residential buildings, everything. 500 families are going to lose their homes so that monster can build luxury condos." Alexander felt the world tilt sideways. He'd been so focused on his personal transformation that he'd completely lost track of Kane Industries' ongoing operations. His executive team had been moving forward with previously approved plans, and one of those plans apparently involved the redevelopment of Sarah's neighborhood. "When?" he managed to ask. "The paperwork was filed yesterday. They're calling it urban renewal, but it's just gentrification with a corporate logo. They'll offer everyone below market buyouts, and if people don't sell, they'll use eminent domain to force them out." Sarah's voice was getting stronger, fueled by righteous anger. 60 years this community center has been here. 60 years of serving people who have nowhere else to go. And some billionaire psychopath is going to destroy it so he can make more money he doesn't need. Alexander's mind was racing. He could stop this. One phone call and the entire project would be cancelled. But making that call would require him to reveal his identity, and revealing his identity would destroy his relationship with Sarah and obliterate any chance he had of continuing his new life. Maybe there's something we can do," he said carefully. "Someone we could appeal to. Some way to fight this." Sarah laughed bitterly. "Fight Alexander Kane? With what army? The man has armies of lawyers, unlimited money, and politicians in his pocket. People like us don't win against people like him." She started pacing, her mind working furiously. "Although, Alex, you said you worked in finance, right? You must have connections in the corporate world. Is there anyone you know who might have influence with Kane Industries? Anyone who could help us understand their plans or maybe find a legal challenge?" Alexander's throat felt like it was closing. Here was Sarah, the woman he loved, asking him to use his connections to fight himself. The irony was so cruel it was almost laughable. I might know some people. Let me make some calls, see what I can find out." "Really?" Hope flickered in Sarah's eyes for the first time since the phone call. "You would do that for us?" "I would do anything for you," Alexander said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Over the next 3 days, Alexander lived in a nightmare of his own making. During the day, he worked alongside Sarah and the other volunteers to organize resistance to the Kane Industries development. They held community meetings, contacted local politicians, reached out to media outlets, and planned protests. Alexander found himself in the surreal position of helping to organize opposition to his own company while simultaneously trying to figure out how to stop the development without revealing his identity. Meanwhile, Sarah threw herself into the fight with the passionate intensity of someone protecting everything she'd ever cared about. She spoke to reporters about corporate greed and community destruction. She organized neighborhood meetings where families shared stories about what the community center meant to them. She stayed up until 2 in the morning writing grant applications for emergency funding that might help them relocate if they lost their building. Alexander watched her exhaust herself fighting an enemy she didn't know was sitting right beside her, and the guilt was eating him alive. "I'm scared, Alex," she admitted one night as they sat in her small apartment, surrounded by legal documents and community petitions. "Not just about losing the center, but about what happens to the families we serve. Mrs. Rodriguez has lived in her apartment for 30 years. Where is she supposed to go? The Martinez kids use our after-school program because both their parents work doubles. Who's going to watch them? We're not just losing a building, we're losing a community." Alexander held her while she cried, his heart breaking with the knowledge that he was the source of her pain. He'd found the most perfect, pure love of his life, and he was destroying it with his own hands. That night, after Sarah fell asleep, Alexander made a decision. He was going to stop the development, consequences be damned. He couldn't watch the woman he loved suffer to protect his secret anymore. He would find a way to save the community center and the neighborhood, even if it meant losing Sarah when she inevitably learned the truth. But he was too late. When he arrived at Kane Industries the next morning to begin the process of canceling the development, Marcus Webb was waiting in his office with a thick folder and a grim expression. "We need to talk," Marcus said, closing the door behind him. "About where you've been spending your time." Alexander faced an impossible choice. He could reveal his identity and lose Sarah forever, or he could continue lying and watch her world burn. But then his board made the decision for him. They scheduled a press conference to announce the community center's demolition, and they wanted Alexander there to deliver the killing blow personally. The press conference was packed. Sarah and her supporters were there to protest, not knowing they were about to come face to face with their greatest enemy. When Alexander walked onto that stage, the love of his life was in the front row, and the look in her eyes when she realized who he was would haunt him forever. Marcus Webb's folder contained photographs. Dozens of them. Alexander entering the community center. Alexander tutoring children. Alexander serving meals. Alexander kissing Sarah Martinez in the kitchen after hours. His own security team had been documenting his transformation without him realizing it. "The board is concerned," Marcus said, spreading the photos across Alexander's desk like evidence in a criminal trial. "Your performance has been declining for months. You've been making uncharacteristically soft decisions, delaying profitable acquisitions, questioning strategies that have made this company billions. And now we know why." Alexander stared at a photograph of himself laughing with Marcus Williams, the 8-year-old he'd been tutoring. In the image, his face was relaxed, genuinely happy in a way he hadn't been since childhood. It was the face of a man who'd remembered how to be human. "This is a problem, Alex," Marcus continued. "The shareholders are asking questions. The board is losing confidence. And frankly, some of us are wondering if you've lost your mind. A billionaire playing house with homeless people and community activists? It's not just unprofessional, it's dangerous." "Dangerous how?" Alexander asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Because it makes you vulnerable. Because it compromises your judgment. Because the woman you're apparently infatuated with is actively organizing opposition to our East Side development project, a project worth $800 million in projected revenue." Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "Here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow morning, we're holding a press conference to announce the East Side development. You're going to be there, you're going to announce the project personally, and you're going to make it clear that Kane Industries doesn't negotiate with community activists. You're going to kill this protest movement before it gains any more momentum. And if I refuse, then the board will call for a vote of no confidence. You'll be removed as CEO of your own company, and the development will proceed anyway. The only difference is that you'll lose everything you've built and still watch your girlfriend's community center get demolished." Alexander felt trapped in a nightmare of his own making. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built, everything he'd discovered about himself over the past few months, it was all colliding in the most devastating way possible. "There's one more thing," Marcus said, pulling out a final photograph. This one showed Alexander and Sarah embracing outside her apartment building. "We know she has no idea who you really are. We know you've been living a complete lie for months. If you don't handle this situation properly, if you try to sabotage this development, we'll make sure she learns the truth in the most public, humiliating way possible." The threat hung in the air like poison. Alexander could see exactly how it would play out. Sarah learning his identity through media exposure, understanding that every moment they'd shared had been built on deception, realizing that the man she loved was actually the monster she'd dedicated her life to fighting. "You have 18 hours to decide," Marcus said, gathering up the photographs. "Tomorrow at 10 a.m., you're either Alexander Kane, CEO of Kane Industries, or you're nothing at all." That night, Alexander didn't go to Sarah's apartment. He couldn't bear to look into her trusting eyes knowing what was coming. Instead, he sat in his penthouse, staring out at the city lights and trying to find a path that didn't end in complete destruction. He could reveal the truth to Sarah himself, before the press conference. But she would never forgive him for the months of deception, never trust him again, never believe that his feelings were real. He could step down from Kane Industries, but that would only delay the inevitable. The board would proceed with the development, and Sarah's community would still be destroyed. Or he could do what Marcus expected: show up at the press conference, announce the development as Alexander Kane, and watch Sarah's world crumble while she learned that the man she loved was actually her greatest enemy. The next morning arrived with cruel efficiency. Alexander dressed in his most expensive suit, the armor of wealth and power he'd worn for so many years. Looking in the mirror, he saw the old Alexander Kane staring back, cold, calculating, untouchable. But inside, he was screaming. The press conference was held in the ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, just 6 blocks from Sarah's community center. As Alexander's car pulled up to the venue, he could see the protesters already gathering outside. Sarah had organized them efficiently: families from the neighborhood, volunteers from the community center, local activists and politicians who supported their cause. And there she was, standing at the front of the group with a megaphone, leading chants about community rights and corporate responsibility. She was wearing the same dress she'd worn on their first official date, and seeing her in it made Alexander's chest tighten with grief for what he was about to lose. The hotel ballroom was packed with reporters, city officials, and Kane Industries executives. Alexander walked to the podium with the measured stride of a man heading to his own execution, knowing that Sarah and her supporters were being allowed into the back of the room to witness the announcement that would destroy their lives. He looked out at the crowd and found Sarah immediately. She was standing near the back, next to Mrs. Rodriguez and several other families from the neighborhood. Her face was set with determined defiance, ready to fight whatever corporate monster was about to speak. She had no idea she was looking at the man who'd held her while she cried, who'd taught her kids how to solve math problems, who'd told her he loved her just 3 nights ago. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice carrying the authority that had intimidated world leaders and corporate rivals. "Thank you for coming. I'm Alexander Kane, CEO of Kane Industries." He saw the exact moment when Sarah recognized his voice. Saw her face go pale, saw her hand fly to her mouth in shock and horror. Saw the moment when the woman he loved realized that everything she'd believed about him, everything they'd built together, had been a lie. The look in her eyes, betrayal, devastation, complete heartbreak, hit Alexander like a physical blow. In that moment, he understood that he'd lost her forever, regardless of what he said next. But he also understood something else. He couldn't be the monster anymore. Not even to save himself. But what happened next shocked everyone in that room, including Alexander himself. Instead of announcing the demolition, he did something that would cost him everything he'd spent his life building. Something that would prove love really can change even the darkest heart. Alexander looked directly at Sarah and said the words that would end his career but save his soul: "I am canceling this project permanently. Kane Industries will instead be funding this community center for the next 50 years. And to ensure this never happens again, I am giving away my entire fortune and dissolving my company." The silence in the ballroom was deafening. Alexander could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the shock radiating from every person in the room. Behind him, he heard Marcus Webb whisper, "What the hell are you doing?" But he didn't turn around. His eyes were locked on Sarah's face, watching as shock gave way to confusion, confusion gave way to disbelief, and disbelief gave way to something that might have been hope. The East Side Community Center, Alexander continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, has served this community for 60 years. It has fed hungry families, educated children, provided healthcare connections, and created a network of mutual support that represents the best of what humanity can accomplish. He paused, looking directly at Sarah as he spoke. I have spent my career destroying communities like this one. I have prioritized profit over people, growth over compassion, and efficiency over humanity. I have caused immeasurable harm to thousands of families, and I can never undo that damage. The room erupted in whispers and shocked murmurs, but Alexander continued. However, I can choose to stop causing harm. I can choose to use my resources to heal instead of hurt, to build instead of destroy, to serve instead of dominate. He pulled out a folder of legal documents that he'd prepared in the early hours of the morning, working with his personal lawyer to draft papers that would legally bind him to his promises. Kane Industries will immediately establish a $100 million endowment for the East Side Community Center, ensuring its operation and expansion for the next 50 years. We will also establish a $500 million fund for community development in neighborhoods that have been damaged by our past business practices. Alexander's voice broke slightly as he continued. Furthermore, I am donating my personal fortune, approximately $12.7 billion, to establish the Kane Foundation for Community Restoration. This foundation will work to repair the damage caused by predatory business practices and will be administered by community leaders, not corporate executives. The ballroom had gone completely silent. Reporters were frantically taking notes, executives were staring in shock, and Sarah was standing frozen in the back of the room, tears streaming down her face. Finally, Alexander said, looking directly at Sarah one last time, I am resigning as CEO of Kane Industries, effective immediately. The company will be dissolved, its assets distributed among employees and the communities we have served. I will retain only enough money to live modestly, and I will spend the rest of my life working to earn redemption for the harm I have caused. He stepped back from the podium as chaos erupted in the ballroom. Reporters shouted questions, executives argued with each other, and security tried to maintain order. But Alexander only had eyes for Sarah, who was pushing through the crowd toward the front of the room. When she reached the stage, they stared at each other across a distance that felt like an ocean. Everything Alexander wanted to say was trapped in his throat, apologies for the deception, explanations for his transformation, declarations of love that he no longer had the right to make. Why? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible above the chaos around them. Because you taught me what love actually looks like, Alexander replied. And because I'd rather lose everything as a man trying to be worthy of you than keep everything as a monster who could never deserve you. Sarah's face was streaked with tears, her expression cycling through emotions too complex for words. You lied to me. For months, you lied to me about everything. Yes, Alexander said simply. I lied about my name, my background, my history. But I never lied about loving you. I never lied about who I was becoming when I was with you. That man you fell in love with, Alex Marshall, he's who I really am underneath all the damage I've done. He's who I want to be for the rest of my life. I don't know if I can forgive this, Sarah whispered. I don't expect you to, Alexander replied. I just needed you to know that loving you changed me completely. That every moment we spent together was the most real thing I've ever experienced. And that I would rather give up everything I thought I wanted than continue being someone you could never love. Security was moving toward the stage, trying to restore order to the chaos Alexander had created. Sarah looked at him one last time, her face a map of heartbreak and confusion and something that might have been admiration. I need time, she said. I understand, Alexander replied. I'll be at the community center every day, doing whatever work you'll allow me to do. Not as Alexander Kane, not as Alex Marshall, but as someone trying to earn the right to be called human again. 6 months later, Alexander Kane was no longer a billionaire. He was Alex Martinez, he'd taken Sarah's last name, working as a teacher in the very community center he'd once tried to destroy. He'd given away $12.7 billion, kept only enough to live modestly, and discovered that being truly wealthy had nothing to do with money. Sarah forgave him, not because what he'd done was acceptable, but because she'd seen his genuine transformation. They built a new life together, not on lies or power, but on the foundation of second chances and the belief that anyone can change if they truly want to. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate. In the weeks following the press conference, Alexander had faced lawsuits from shareholders, investigations from federal regulators, and death threats from former employees who blamed him for years of suffering. The media had dubbed him everything from the billionaire who lost his mind to the corporate saint, and neither characterization felt accurate. More difficult than the public scrutiny was earning back Sarah's trust. She'd agreed to let him volunteer at the community center, but their personal relationship remained fractured. She was kind to him, professional, but the easy intimacy they'd shared was gone, replaced by careful politeness and emotional distance. Alexander threw himself into the work with desperate dedication. He arrived at the community center before dawn and stayed until late at night. He cleaned bathrooms, prepared meals, tutored children, helped elderly residents with paperwork, and gradually began to understand the difference between charity and justice. Charity is when you give someone what they need, Sarah explained to him one evening as they cleaned up after a community dinner. Justice is when you change the systems that created the need in the first place. Alexander had thought his massive donations would be enough, but Sarah helped him understand that money alone couldn't repair the damage caused by decades of corporate exploitation. Real change required sustained commitment, community leadership, and a fundamental shift in how resources were distributed. So Alexander began studying community organizing, learning from activists who'd been fighting corporate power for years. He attended city council meetings, joined neighborhood associations, and slowly began to understand how systemic change actually happened. The Kane Foundation, administered by community leaders rather than corporate executives, began funding grassroots organizations across the country. But more importantly, Alexander began using his business knowledge to help communities resist corporate exploitation rather than enable it. He testified before Congress about predatory business practices. He consulted with community groups facing hostile takeovers. He used his insider knowledge of corporate strategies to help level the playing field between big business and ordinary people. Gradually, Sarah began to see that his transformation was real and lasting. Not just the grand gesture of giving away his fortune, but the daily choice to show up, listen, and follow the leadership of people who'd been fighting these battles long before he arrived. "I'm starting to believe you," she told him one evening as they walked through the neighborhood that was now thriving thanks to the Community Investment Fund. "Not because of what you gave away, but because of who you've chosen to become." Their romance rekindled slowly, carefully, built on a foundation of honesty and shared purpose rather than deception and hidden identities. When Alexander asked Sarah to marry him, he did it in the community center kitchen where they'd first kissed, surrounded by the families they served together. "I can't promise I'll ever fully forgive the man you used to be," Sarah said through tears as she accepted his proposal. "But I love the man you've chosen to become." They were married in the community center's main room, with Mrs. Rodriguez officiating and Marcus Williams, now 16 and headed to college on a scholarship funded by the Kane Foundation, serving as the best man. The reception featured food prepared by families from the neighborhood, music from local teenagers, and speeches from community leaders about the power of redemption and second chances. Alexander, now legally Alex Martinez, had never been happier. He woke up every morning in a small apartment 3 blocks from the community center, beside the woman he loved, knowing that his day would be spent lifting people up instead of tearing them down. He taught math at the local high school, coordinated community organizing efforts, and served on the board of several grassroots organizations. His net worth was approximately $50,000, and he'd never felt richer in his life. Today, the man once known as the corporate reaper spends his days teaching children to read and helping families stay in their homes. He has no empire, no fear-based power, no billions in the bank. But he has something he never had before: peace, love, and the respect that comes from lifting people up instead of tearing them down. Alexander Kane learned that true power isn't about how many people fear you, It's about how many people you can help. And sometimes, the greatest victory is knowing when to surrender everything you thought you wanted for something you never knew you needed. On quiet Sunday mornings, Alex Martinez would sometimes stand in the community center's main room and remember the man he used to be. The empty feeling of unlimited wealth. The hollow satisfaction of defeating enemies who couldn't fight back. The profound loneliness of being feared rather than loved. Then Sarah would appear beside him, or one of his students would run up with a math problem to solve, or Mrs. Rodriguez would ask for help organizing the food pantry, and he would remember that he'd traded a fortune for something infinitely more valuable, a life worth living. The East Side Community Center now served 1,200 families across 3 locations. The Kane Foundation had provided seed funding for 200 community organizations nationwide. But more importantly, Alex Martinez had learned the difference between being powerful and being useful, between being feared and being respected, between accumulating wealth and creating value. Sometimes people would recognize him, the former billionaire who'd given it all away for love. Some called him crazy, others called him saint, but Alex knew he was neither. He was simply a man who'd learned, almost too late, that the only victory that mattered was the one that let you sleep peacefully beside someone who loved you for who you chose to be, not what you'd managed to accumulate. If this story moved you, if it made you believe that people can change, share it with someone who needs hope. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that it's never too late to choose love over fear. What would you choose? Power and wealth, or love and redemption? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories about impossible transformations, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because next week, I'm going to tell you about a woman who married a man for his money, and discovered he was giving it all away to find her.